Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. Today we are joined by one of our country's best novelists and most successful, which is a nice combination. He is T.C. Boyle. His new novel is called The Women, and the women are the women, married and unmarried, the wives and paramours of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Well, thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that nice introduction. Yes, it is rare when literary books get to be bestsellers, and, it helps everybody. It helps the economy, it helps my publishers, and it helps everybody out there who can read something good for a change.
Speaking of your publisher, your publisher describes you in ways I've never heard before.
Well, let's hear some of it.
About an author.
What did they say?
In their press material, they begin, T.C. Boyle, sly as well as intrepid.
Not bad.
Not bad.
I should tell you about. I don't see the press material usually. I don't know what it says.
Yeah.
And I trust them. They're fine. I've been with them my whole life. But there was one of my books. It must have been 10 years ago. I forget which one now. My editor had written some blurb of how terrific I am.
Yeah.
I didn't really like it, so I rewrote it. And every time I read it, it brings tears to my eyes. It's so right and perfect.
You still have the same editor, or have you parted ways?
I still do. Not only that, I introduced him to his wife.
In a sense, this book about Wright fits in with what you've been doing lately. You've written a book called The Road to Wellville.
Yes. About
the man whose boxes sit on breakfast tables.
John Harvey Kellogg,
yes.
Inventor of the cornflake, but also, little known to the public, the enema machine.
Yes, which is very important in some situations.
Right. And then I also wrote about Alfred C. Kinsey in The Inner Circle, and all three of these figures have something in common. They are all egomaniacs. They are all narcissists. They all created something that affects us today, but they really didn't much care about you or me or anybody else, except as you fit into their regime.
Right. And, to say that they are self-centered is to understate the case.
When I first told my editor, Paul Slovak, that I was doing a book about Frank Lloyd Wright in fiction, he said, "Great. We'll do a box set of the three of them, the great egomaniacs of the 20th century."
Oh, it'd be as fat as the Harry Potter box.
It would be.
Yeah, which is something to think about. I mean, the box was, I guess it was pretty successful. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Incidentally, I have the same publisher in England as the author of Harry Potter, Bloomsbury. And a few years ago, my editor called me about a new book of mine coming out, and she was telling me how wonderful it is and how well we're going to do. And I interrupted her and I said, I expect we'll do probably better than that children's author you have. What's her name? Rawlings or something? And there was a dead silence, and then, oh, ho, ho, ho.
Well, in this biographical novel, there are a couple of things you do quite differently. You approach Wright through the women. He's had what you might call, with all of his women and loves, kind of tempestuous experiences.
Oh, absolutely. His life is ready-made for a novelist, as was the life of Kinsey and of Kellogg too. But Wright more than any. He just seemed to want to live in tumult all the time. He and I are similar in that we're both artists. We both create something, and the metaphor here is making a book is like building a house. But where we part ways. And by the way, I'm the only American writer in history only to have one wife. I like peace.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah, I like peace and tranquility in my life in order to work. He seemed to have tumult. People pursuing him. He was arrested on Mann Act charges and thrown in jail. The press just had a field day with his life. He had bill collectors. He was arrested by the sheriff once for a non-payment of bills. He needed this kind of thing in order to work.
One of the lines that recurs in the book because of what happens to him, he's built this place in the woods of Wisconsin, Taliesin, which I've been to, and it keeps burning down on him. And the ashes are still hot, and you write almost every instance Frank goes to the drawing board and starts to sketch.
He was incredibly resilient. I have to give him that. You know, I'm something of a satirist, and I'm having some fun with his character. But on the other hand, I still do admire him. He was the kind of artist that I would like to be, that I think I am, who is constantly living for his art and producing things. The difference is, I don't need anybody to finance my art. He needed to be a con man in order to convince some wealthy person to give him the money to create what he saw on his drawing board.
Well, he was always looking for commissions and stuff like that, and you don't have to.
Well, you know, it's nice to sell books and get paid, but yes.
At T.C. Boyle, sly and intrepid, he tells the story of the women backwards and forwards. You're not surprised, are you?
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
T.C. Boyle is the guest. The title of his new novel, The Women. It's all about the women of Frank Lloyd Wright. And a book list gave it a starred review, and there's a part in here that I want to get to. So I'm going to read pretty much all of what the publisher gave me to read.
I'd love to hear it.
Are you ready?
The more praise I hear, the better I feel.
Pay close attention. Boyle delves deeply into social and emotional territory to write imaginatively and meaningfully about, here's the phrase, the operatic drama of Wright's world. An ideal subject for this protean, caring, and wisely satirical writer. Wisely satirical. You can take that to the bank. Boyle's rendering of Taliesin, the cursed Wisconsin home of Wright's dubious fellowship, is positively Gothic, and for all of the swift fury of the plot, this is a character-driven novel. Boyle is electrifying in this gorgeous novel of artistic conviction, exalted romance, and appalling moral failings. There's a movie here. There's a movie.
Well, let's make it into an opera.
Oh, yes,
You know?
and then we can
Who's
film.
going to do the music? I'll do the libretto.
All right,
no problem.
And then we can film the opera and make even more bucks. Oh, my gosh. Woo. You know, I saw this. I saw resonance in this comparison with the opera. From the total romantic start at the beginning to the total shrew, particularly the Chicago chase phase. I'm talking about Miriam.
Yeah, Miriam took the book over for me.
Yeah.
I loved her as a character. What I love about these situations is that everything in the book is true. If someone listening here knows nothing about Frank Lloyd Wright and they read The Women, you get the whole scope of his career, who he was, what he did, but you get it from the point of view of the people around him primarily.
Right.
And his second wife, Miriam, to me was just ready-made for satire, of course. She was a morphine addict. She was a beautiful woman who had spent 10 years in Paris. She had high expectations, and as far as stealing the limelight, she was every bit Frank Lloyd Wright's equal.
And she was, at least at the beginning, the quintessential romantic. She comes to him from Paris, meets him, I guess, in Chicago, and recites poetry.
Yeah, well, let me just back up for a second and let people know about the real drama of this. Of course, as many people know about his life, his mistress, for whom he left his wife, Mamie Borthwick Cheney, was murdered at Taliesin by a dissatisfied servant. She was killed with a roofing axe, and so were her 2 children and 4 other people. The servant burned the house down.
That's known as a very dissatisfied servant.
I think so.
Very dissatisfied.
So the house burns down, and Frank was then building Midway Gardens in Chicago. He wasn't present. He came back on the train, and this dreadful thing, the newspapers were all over it. Reporters were on the train with him. It's horrible. 6 months later, however, amongst many of the sympathy letters he was getting from around the world, he got one from Miriam Maud Noel, who, as we've described, is this exotic woman from Paris. She was really from Tennessee, but she lived in Paris for 10 years. Within 6 months, he was having a sexual relationship with her. And he tells in his autobiography, which, of course, is as much fiction as what I've written here, but he says, anyway, Miriam came into his office for their first meeting, and she's dressed to the nines in this latest fashions of the big hat and all the scarves, and she was wearing a sealskin cape, and she had a monocle, and the cigarette, the whole thing. And they immediately, you know how it is when two people are very attracted and they know something's in the air. Chemistry. And they talk on and on about poetry and romance. And then finally she took a breath and said, "So how do you like me?" And he said, "I've never seen anything like you." And boom, that was it.
And then she starts reciting poetry in French.
Indeed.
Which really takes him aback. But then he comes right back with some English poetry.
Some good old American poetry.
She's impressed.
Yeah.
She really, really is impressed. The book, in a sense, begins and ends with her.
It's interesting. She did take over the book. When I was a student in the Ira Writers Workshop, all the old writers of the country, whom we loved, our heroes, would come and they would talk to us, and they were either boring or not, they're drunk or not, whatever it was. But almost all of them would say, the characters take over, and I don't know what to do about it. And I always thought privately, well, what crap.
Yeah,
but in fact, it is true, because what I'm doing and what most creative writers are doing is letting the unconscious take over, creating something that you don't have a blueprint for. You don't know what it will be. So sometimes it's true. You don't know what this character will evolve into. And as the book went on, I had the most sympathy for Miriam, although I think she's also a figure of comic fun here.
Oh, she's everything. That's what makes her so wonderful as, the person who, in a sense, carries the book from phase to phase. And as we're going to discuss in the next segment, carries it both backwards and forwards, because you're that kind of guy.
Okay, good. Look forward to it.
When we come back, we are definitely going to get to the backwardness and forwardness of the women, the new novel by T.C. Boyle. You just can't miss it.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
The Women is the title of a new novel by T.C. Boyle. It's published by Viking, which we've neglected to say up until this point.
Yep, I'm very lucky in that I've been with them my whole life, and all my books have always been in print, all 20 of them.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I'm the kind of guy who likes to stay with what he's got.
Yeah.
I'm the only writer in history, as I said, who only had one wife. I've got the same publisher here and abroad, the same agent, the same friends I grew up with, and it gives me comfort.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's a different way of doing publishing. It's a way that used to be the norm a million years ago, but certainly isn't anymore.
Yep.
Certainly isn't anymore.
That's because the only truth of human life is that everything always gets worse. We know that. We know that, but we deal with it.
The Times Book Review, in evaluating your book, said something that I just want to mention, because if anybody out there was wondering what the hook is on this book, what the essence of it is, the Times reviewer says Boyle doesn't pay much attention to the concentrated effort that Wright put into his work. It may be that in pursuing Wright's emotional life, Boyle scants his intellect and artistic genius, but that seems deliberate. Love, not architecture, is the focus here.
That is a pretty good hook.
That's great.
There's another hook, too. It says, is it easy to live with a genius? Which I think I gave them. They asked me to write some little thing about it.
Yeah, here it is.
And I love that title right there, because you have to ask my wife about that. She treats me as if I'm a household servant.
She thinks she's Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other part of the TBR says, Boyle at his best, a mesmerizing story of women who invest everything at great risk in that mysterious bank of feeling named Frank Lloyd Wright.
Oh, I like that. You could just read these nice things all day long. It makes me feel great, especially when I'm so tired.
And let's face it, I read them pretty well, too.
You do?
Yeah.
You give it dramatic emphasis.
Yes. Now, one of my favorite characters in the book is not a woman. It's the gentleman from
Tadashi Sato.
the East, yes. And you made him up.
Yes.
But in another sense, I think your research told you that there's a way of bringing together all or many of the aspects of young men and women who went there to learn.
Yes, that's correct. And of course, Frank Lloyd Wright was most influenced by the Japanese, and he spent many years there building the Imperial Hotel. He was a collector of Japanese woodblock prints, and he earned his living by trading in these prints during the teens. And so Tadashi Sato is an invented character, but he's similar to many of the apprentices.
Yes.
Frank Lloyd Wright, during the Depression, didn't have any money. He was living in this grand estate of Taliesin, and he needed people to work it. And so he decided to have an apprenticeship in which young architects would come from around the world and stay with him, peel potatoes, clear the fields,
wash
slop the
dishes,
hogs, wash dishes, and also, when the time was right, would serve him by being his draftsman. And so I invented a character, Tadashi, who takes this story forward so I can tell the story of Frank Lloyd Wright's later years from the 1930s through his death in 1959.
One of the things that he does early in the book, for me, because I remembered it, is that he lets us know the difference between what's going on at Taliesin in the middle of the Midwest and what's going on in the middle of the Midwest for everybody else. He's trying to find his way to Taliesin, and it's a hot day. He's driving from Chicago, and he stops for a hamburger. And this guy looks at him kind of strange because, he's Chinese or Japanese. And he finally says in his bib overalls, "Well, Jesus H. Christ, you're a Chinaman, ain't you?"
Yeah. Well,
and that
also
sums it all up.
Yes, it does, because he's an exotic, and so is Frank Lloyd Wright. Even though he is a Wisconsin farm boy, Frank Lloyd Wright, he became an exotic. Look at the way he dressed. He was famous for his dress. He wore capes and trailing scarves, and he had a cane with him at all times, and the hats. And so, he brought exotics to Wisconsin. And this also enables me to talk about racial prejudice and other themes that come up in my work.
It's great. It really is great. Now, one of the things Sato does for me, he gives me in this book a couple of belly laughs. I mean, in his footnotes, some of them are just great.
Well, let me set it up for the listeners. The way the story is told, it's presumably written by Sato himself as a memoir. Who was Frank Lloyd Wright? Who were his women? But in fact, he had a collaborator. We don't know how much English he knows. He had a collaborator, his grandson-in-law, the Irish-American failed novelist, Seamus O'Flaherty. So the footnotes, we have Tadashi looking through this text and responding to it because he's surprised at what the text is. So he gives many levels of meaning of what is real and what is not.
Now, one of the real notes is the Wrights are about to get incarcerated yet again. And Wright's picture is taken, and he describes in befuddled, as if he's just realized that he's put on some stranger's coat and hat and taken up an ersatz cane. This is on the way to jail. And we're on our way out of here because I'm Jim Foster. This has been Conversations on the Coast. T.C. Boyle is our guest, and the book is The Women. Don't miss it.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.